In new reporting from Twitter Files author Michael Shellenberger, he writes that last week, the European Union declared it would punish Twitter from withdrawing from its, quote, supposedly voluntary censorship laws. European Commissioner for Internal Market of the EU, Thierry Breton, said, "You can run, but you can't hide. Beyond voluntary commitments, fighting disinformation will be a legal obligation under the Digital Services Act as of August 25th. Our teams will be ready for enforcement."
Michael Shellenberger is with us now to discuss how the governments of the world are impacting the free speech question. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So, what is going on with our European counterparts? Brianna and I have talked a lot about how Europe obviously doesn't have the First Amendment, has somewhat more freedom, paradoxically, on its government's part to make different choices with respect to speech and privacy, and then also to police misinformation and do things like that to an extent that U.S. government officials can only, kind of indirectly push companies to make those decisions. They can't, commit them under the force of law, although, one could argue it eventually ends up having the same effect. What should we be worried about here when it comes to European regulation of the tech space?
Well, sure. I mean, I think people don't realize in the United States yet, but what is happening around the world is that governments are cracking down on free speech. It's happening simultaneously in a number of countries. It's happening in Ireland, where the law would allow the police to go into people's homes and search their computers. And if they find materials they view as hateful, they would assume that those materials were for dissemination and they would be presumed guilty. In the UK, there's a so-called online safety bill, which is moving forward, which would allow the government to access encrypted private direct messages. And then in Europe, they are close to implementing this Digital Services Act laws that would allow a very significant and we believe growing amount of censorship of users on social media. And as you read there, they've threatened Twitter. Twitter pulled out of the so-called voluntary disinformation board. They are now saying that they are going to make that mandatory. They're going to enforce the laws around it starting in August. But we also see crackdowns in places like Brazil, Australia, New Zealand. And as I note in that piece, often to the applause of news media organizations that have a direct economic interest in shutting down their competitors, since much of the censorship is often aimed at alternative media. And I point out there that it's not wrong to point out that one of the motivations for the censorship industrial complex, because we've certainly looked at state security institutions having an interest in censorship. We've talked about various military and intelligence organizations having an interest, but also I think we've seen that commercial media interests also have an interest in expanding censorship of their competitors, and often on the behalf or at least in cooperation with major advertisers.
Yeah, so we obviously have an American-centric idea of what speech rights should be, but the reality is that obviously other places in the world, whether it's the EU or India or Turkey, have different standards. And recently, Twitter has been under scrutiny as to how it has engaged with those standards and whether it would risk being shut down entirely in those countries or kowtow in some way to what those more authoritarian speech standards are in those countries. Recently, I'm sure you're aware that Elon Musk got into a back and forth with journalist Matt Yglesias, who was pointing out that it's fine to go ahead and choose to still be in service in those countries and succumb to their more restricted free speech requirements, but you are not then being necessarily a free speech absolutist. What do you make of that trade-off, and how do you expect Twitter to respond to the EU forcing these so-called voluntary restrictive speech disinformation requirements onto the company?
I think the first thing is one of the most important and interesting stories in the world right now, which is what will Twitter do if and when the EU starts making censorship demands on Twitter. I think it's going to be very hard for Twitter and other social media companies not to comply and stay in those countries. They're in a position where they can literally cut off access to Twitter in Europe. We talked about it before when I was on the show, but my preference, I think, would be that Twitter allow governments to cut off access to Twitter, which would mean that the citizens would have to use a VPN or virtual private network to basically get around their own country's restrictions, which of course itself may be illegal and is risky. But I think that's sort of my own wishful feeling about it. I think that the reality is that these corporations, including Twitter, are going to ultimately need to comply with governments if they're going to operate there. And that's why I think ultimately what you have to have is a citizens movement around the world, including in the United States, that instead of us responding defensively to other countries' restrictive free speech laws, including having speech censorship agencies effectively, that we need something much more like the First Amendment around the world, where really there is no government agency regulating speech. It gets worked out in the courts. What people have thought is correct. We have the freest speech in the United States of anywhere in the world. I think it's a big part of the reason why so many people want to come to the United States, since I think free speech is a fundamental human right. It's not just instrumental to democracy or capitalism. It's a part of what it means to be fully human. But I do think that really the onus is on us as citizens, particularly on us as journalists, and I think attorneys and policy advocates who are close to these issues, to really build a global grassroots movement to fight against the censorship industrial complex.
I've been thinking recently about how these various policies, whether it's the European Union or elsewhere, can also probably, in some indirect way, benefit, even though they're harmful to companies like Twitter. They could, in a very direct way, because ultimately they're regulations, and regulations can be easier to comply with by already big companies. They can actually further entrench the dominant players in the tech space. Sam Altman, the AI guy, was before Congress, U.S. Congress in recent weeks, talking about what regulations he thinks would be good. He got a really warm reception from both people in both parties, and I'm worried about having speech policies that, while they're on the margins harmful for a Twitter, a Facebook, or a Google, would be utterly crippling to someone who's trying to come along and compete with those companies and do something new in the speech space. And that will, and in fact, Facebook more than Twitter has gone along with some of the, or has signaled openness to specific regulations in a U.S. context, because they know those regulations would hurt Twitter as a smaller company more than Facebook. And I think that's going to be a fascinating dynamic to watch as the European Union moves forward with more speech restrictions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Robbie. I think, look, we're dealing with, at this point, these are social media monopolies. They monopolize a social media utility of a particular kind. And we all can experience the difference of what those are between Facebook and Twitter, for example. I think it is very hard for new entrants. We do also know that Instagram is building a Twitter clone that it intends to launch this summer, which appears to be a much more, I don't want to say serious, but aggressive and probably more well-funded launch than the launch of the Substack Twitter clone earlier this year. So I do think that, I tend to view networks as having very powerful effects, in part because of my work on electricity, and I know that network effects are real. But I also know that real-world events happen that surprise us, including Elon Musk buying Twitter. And you never know. It seems like these technologies are not done evolving. And so as they evolve, in particular with AI, we might still see some market disruption. But ultimately, I do think that rather than sort of, pleading to CEOs of social media companies, we should plead. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think ultimately we need to go to our governments and also establish a kind of culture and a politics that really celebrates free speech. I just think we see that the censorship that's coming from governments reflects a sort of self-censorship that we've seen coming from the culture of growing intolerance and a widening, what psychologists call concept creep, of what people think causes harm in the real world. So now people think, causing offense online causes real world harm. And I do think that that's why I keep emphasizing you need some sort of global citizens movement that demands that governments allow maximal freedom to American free speech standards around the world, rather than us having to respond constantly to the Europeans or to the Turks or the Indians or anybody else making their demands on the speech rights of people online.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that idea and the question and the implications of that idea for the question of whether or not it is better or worse. Obviously, none of us own Twitter. This isn't our decision. But abstractly, is it better or worse for Elon Musk to say, okay, well, it's better for people to have access to some Twitter in a place like Turkey and get some of their views heard in the middle of an election, or in India, let's say. rather than shut the whole thing down. There is an argument that says, well, if you shut the whole thing down and people across Europe who are used to having access to Twitter and who really enjoy the app and feel connected globally because of the app are going to be more likely to foment a people's movement, a global people's movement, because they are feeling very dramatically what it means for their government to have these restrictions on disinformation or however they're characterizing it. Do you have any thoughts about the perhaps negative consequences of saying, well, we're going to go ahead and bend the knee to whatever government standards there are because it's better at very least to have some Twitter there?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to order my priorities, I would say I think it's better to resist the government's demands for censorship. I also recognize that they may not be completely realistic, and that platforms are probably going to bend to the will of governments. You know, I am being censored on Facebook at this moment for my views on the environment, which is very upsetting, and I believe I am in the right. I have no way to make appeal. I still publish on Facebook, but it's clear I can't go viral on Facebook. I do still like to publish there, but ultimately there needs to be transparency required on those platforms so that they have to show the ways in which they're stifling it, because there's a certain level of crazy making when you can't see the ways in which these platforms are stifling you. But I do think that the broader issue remains the same, which is that ultimately we are free citizens governed by our governments. And even in countries where they're more authoritarian, like in Turkey, there are still possibilities to change the laws. And so I do think that our focus has to shift from a kind of intense focus that we've had, particularly after Elon Musk takeover, on the CEOs of these companies and their decisions. I really think we need to turn this conversation back to ourselves and recognize that we have an obligation to fight for these rights, which we've inherited for several hundred years, which have been hard won, which were not universal at first 250 years ago, but have been gradually won by various groups in these countries, to really demand, and has to be a citizens movement demanding it, that we do not view speech as in the whole harmful, only in various special exceptions for it. We do not believe the government has a role in censoring it, and to the extent to which social medias need regulation, it's in the direction of more speech in the form of more transparency, rather than more cooperation with governments or more restrictions.
Just a quick question about that, though, Michael. Isn't it the reason why they're calling this a voluntary law, it seems, which I think it's not an accurate characterization, but the reason why they're doing that is because you can choose not to comply, but then there are a series of fines, and I think Twitter's fine is calculated based on your percent of the market share, blah, 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 but Twitter's would be about $500 million. What do you make of the world where an argument that says, just pay the fine, don't comply with the policy, go forward in Europe? Is that a good way to maintain your values and also continue to have access in these other parts of the world?
Boy, it might be. That sounds like a lot of money to me. I mean, I think it's even perhaps a lot of money for people that are worth $200 billion. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it'd be interesting to see if you could comply with the fines. My suspicion, though, is that the governments would just ramp up the fines until they complied. And so ultimately, I just come back to, look, this is just something where I think we have to get out of the role of pleading with the social media companies and in a role of taking power. I did want to mention, by the way, that we are hosting a gathering June 22nd and 23rd in London. Russel Brand, Matt Taibbi, and I are taking the stage at Westminster Center on June 22nd, Thursday, June 22nd. All are invited. We expect a sellout audience to really build this global free speech movement, which, we had long expected it would be led by ACLU and that the mainstream news media would be championing this. It's not worked out that way. In fact, in many cases, they're demanding the censorship. So I do think that what we're seeing here and what I'm suggesting at this moment is that this is the moment that we need to actually turn the focus and the responsibility back on ourselves as citizens to demand these rights promised to us by the constitutions of our governments, but also to advocate for them in countries that have never had a First Amendment, because ultimately we are a global internet media communications network, and the censorship that happens in other countries definitely affects us here in the United States.
Three excellent individuals. I'm sure that will be a terrific event. Michael, thanks so much.
Good to be with you guys.